Well, I think everyone is dialing in. This is Scott Martin, and I'll begin the intro. My day job is Executive Director of River Heritage Conservancy here in the Louisville, Southern Indiana region, working on a park that you'll hear a little bit about later. And my volunteer role is as co-chair for the North American region for World Urban Parks. And I just want to give you, on behalf of our organization, a thank you to everyone for showing up and paying attention to this really exciting presentation. And we were really tickled with the quality of the presenters, and I know you'll get a lot out of it. These folks bring a tremendous amount of experience in the field, and we'll have a lot of lessons to share with us. We also want to thank the Epley Institute at IU up the road for their support through the World Parks Academy for delivering these programs. I do want to do a pitch. If you haven't considered becoming a member and joining World Urban Parks, it's a wonderful organization of professionals, probably a lot like yourself, that believe in the value of sharing knowledge, learnings, failures, and successes across oceans, borders, and everything else as we all learn to innovate together and come up with solutions for common problems that we solve. If you're looking for more information on the organization, you can check us out on the Facebooks, the Twitters, the LinkedIns, and then the website that's listed there below. And then within the chat, I will go ahead and add the membership link as well in case you want to pull it back. It's a great group of folks, and we'd love to have you all part of the team that's really starting to innovate globally. One of the campaigns that's going on now is a Growing Green for Parks campaign that has emerged globally. You may see it on some of your feeds now. It's already underway in Australia, New Zealand, the Asia and European regions, where folks are lighting up landmarks in green in recognition of both the service that parks have given us through the pandemic, but also, and just as importantly, as a thank you for the parks professionals that we all work with who've kept these parks up running and functional and doing all the great things they do to help us with our emotional, physical, and mental health during these tough times. For more information on that, you can go to World Urban Parks. The North American date, we're doing one day, will be on June 30th, where we ask you to light your local parks and landmarks green in recognition and then tag appropriately as you see below. More information on this campaign can also be found on the World Urban Parks. After this webinar closes up, this is part of a sequence this year of 2020. Our next one will be on July the 15th. It'll be an exploration of the National Park Cities campaign that emerged in London last year. Daniel Raven Ellison, the creator of the campaign in London, the founder of the National Park Cities Foundation, and then Jane Miller from the States will both be giving you an update and kind of an introduction to this campaign about reinventing what it means to live in our cities and what it means if we recast the idea of living in cities as living in a park. So that'll be on July the 15th at 12 o'clock, and it is also another free presentation. So with that, that's the end of the World Urban Parks intro. I will now turn it over to Michael Boland, and he will take it from here. Michael, thank you so much for arranging this.
All right, great, Scott. Thank you to you and to World Urban Parks, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm delighted that you are joining us from wherever you are on the planet, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Michael Boland. I am Chief Park Officer for the Presidio Trust. And I'm delighted to be speaking with you all today from San Francisco. We have a fantastic program this morning. Sorry, while I get set up here. All right. Fantastic program this morning focused on what I think of as one of the two great environmental challenges we are facing today, climate change. And it's not focused on the science of climate change or the question of whether or not there is such a thing as climate change, but really rather focused on how do we prepare the parks that we all are managing or developing for the various impacts of climate change. How do we adapt them to sea level rise, to flooding, and to fire? And we have a panel of three fantastic speakers this morning. Alison Forrestel, Chief of Natural Resources and Science at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco. Kevin Conger, who is a partner at CMG Landscape Architecture in San Francisco, and Lucinda Sanders, CEO and partner at Boland in Philadelphia. Each of them will share strategies that they're using at three different urban park sites, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco, Crissy Field in San Francisco, and also Louisville's Ohio River Greenway to address the ever-changing impacts of fire, flooding, and sea level rise. So before we get started, I'd like to do two things. Like Scott, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Indiana University Epley Institute and World Urban Parks. And like Scott, I'd also like to make a shameless plug for those of you that aren't members of World Urban Parks to join World Urban Parks. I joined about a year ago and have found the experience absolutely fantastic, an incredible resource, an incredible opportunity to learn best practices for what is happening all around the world. So I really encourage you all to join and welcome those of you that are members here this morning. Lastly, I'd like to just do a little bit of webinar hygiene. I just want to make sure that for those of you that have questions in the course of our program today, please use the Q&A tab to ask a question. I'll be moderating our questions at the end. And so please submit those in the course of the day, in the course of the program, and I'll curate those at the end. If you'd like to speak to one of the other attendees, just use the chat function and reach out to an individual attendee or an individual speaker. For those of you that are not speaking, please stay muted. And if you get feedback, of course, turn off your speakers. For those of you that are looking for continuing education units, Point 1 units is available today. And you can register on provalenceLearning.com. I think Kelly's going to send that link out. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please contact worldparksacademy@gmail.com. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and while she gets set up, I will just tell you a little bit about her. Our first speaker is Alison Forrestel. She is the Chief of Natural Resource Management and Science at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. She's worked for the National Park Service for 17 years in a variety of roles, including serving as the fire ecologist for the San Francisco Bay Network of National Parks for over 8 years. Her areas of focus include park management in the context of climate change, fire ecology and prescribed fire, landscape scale, conservation and management, biodiversity preservation, and creating park communities that are welcoming, inclusive, and relevant to all people. Alison holds a Master of Forestry from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She's also a PhD from UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Good morning, Alison.
Thank you for the introduction, Michael. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and jump right in. Okay, so yes, thanks everyone for being here this morning. I'm going to kick off our program by talking about fire management in an urban park in the era of climate change. Just getting used to wording my slides here. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll start out talking about fire and climate change kind of broadly in the Western US. I'm going to cover the entire field of fire ecology in just one slide, so that should be exciting. And then I'm going to focus the rest of my time talking about what we're doing for fire management here at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco. Okay, so jumping into fire in the Western US, if you've been paying attention to the news the last few years, you've been seeing a lot of headlines like this. This last image is from Arizona just a couple of days ago, where they're seeing a record fire season this summer. Fires have been increasing in the Western United States for the last several decades, starting in the late 1980s. You can see this figure here at the bottom of the screen and this real uptick happening in fire starting in the 80s. This study was done in 2008, and if the last decade were on here, you'd see even more and larger spikes in the area burn kind of off to the right. And what we're seeing is increases in area burned, increases in number of fires each year, and then the fires that are burning hotter. So it's kind of across a bunch of different metrics of wildfire. And we're expecting this trend to continue into the future. This is a figure from a fire and climate change study that just came out of UC Berkeley. It's specific to California, and what it's showing here is the area burned over different periods of a couple of decades. So the figure on the left is the area burned in California from 1961 to 1990. And you can see by the mid 21st century, we're expecting a significant increase in area burned. And by late 21st century, a really dramatic increase in area burned in California, unless we see some kind of major changes in policy and how we're managing carbon emissions. So these are just some more of the statistics specific to California to back this up. These are the largest fires in California from the 1920s through today. And you can see that 5 of those fires happened in the last 10 years. Similarly, these are the most destructive fires in California in terms of the number of buildings burned. And again, 7 of the last 10 most destructive fires in California happened in the last 10 years. So things are getting worse. And then just briefly talking about the connection between climate change and this phenomenon. This figure at the bottom here shows the number of fires above a certain threshold size for the last several decades. And those are the red bars. And then the black line is the average summer temperature over that same time period. And you can see that they track each other very closely. And so what's going on here? We have increased temperatures, increased fire, and that's actually a little more nuanced than perhaps you might think. And one example of this is that in California, in the summer months, nighttime temperatures have been increasing 3 times more quickly than daytime temperatures. And nighttime is a really important time period for fighting fires and putting them out, because firefighters expect that time for the fire behavior to decrease and to be able to use the morning hours to really make a lot of progress on fire suppression. And so when we have more warming nighttime temperatures, we end up with much larger and more intense fires overall. We're also seeing drier conditions. And what I want to say about that is that even if precipitation doesn't change with climate change, if the amount of rainfall we're getting stays the same, we still see drier conditions because with hotter temperatures, we have more evaporation. And so the vegetation is drier, more stressed, more prone to burning. In areas where there's winter snowpack, we're seeing earlier snow melt, and then we're seeing longer fire seasons across the board. The other thing I want to say is that climate change isn't the only thing going on here, but what it's doing is acting as a threat multiplier. So over the last several decades, we have increased suburban and semi-rural development. So when these fires do burn, the human impacts of them in terms of homes destroyed is much higher. And then in the Western United States, we have this history of fire suppression, where from the early 1900s through the late 1980s, the federal government and the land management agencies were very effective in putting out almost every fire. And what that's done is in certain types of ecosystem has led to unnatural conditions where there's more trees in the forest than there naturally should be. And so we have this fire deficit where when a fire does burn, it burns hotter and larger. And what climate change is doing is just multiplying the impacts of these other trends that are already happening. Okay, so here's where I cover the entire field of fire ecology in just one slide. So speaking in generalizations here, but most of the ecosystems in the Western US have evolved with fires. So the species in these ecosystems either can tolerate fire or they actually require fire to persist. So from an ecological point of view, fire is actually, often speaking, beneficial. And then the other thing that I want to point out is that the role of fire is different in different ecosystems. So in some places, for example, the Sierra Nevada of California or parts of Arizona and New Mexico, fire suppression, as I was just talking about, has created these unnatural conditions. And really what's driving the increase in fires that we're seeing today, or one of the things that's driving it, is this unnaturally high amount of fuels. But that's not the case everywhere. And there are other regions of the West, such as Southern California or here in the Bay Area, where really our large fires are driven by weather events, by strong winds, the Santa Ana winds in Southern California, and the Diablo winds here in the Bay Area. And so the state of the fuels, how much vegetation is present and how dry it is less important. And I want to raise that distinction because it has a big impact on how a park manager would think about managing fire in these different kinds of systems. Okay, so shifting gears to what we're doing in the Bay Area in an urban national park to manage fire. So I just wanted to briefly introduce Golden Gate National Recreation Area for folks who aren't familiar with it. We're about 80,000 acres spanning 3 counties, Marin County in the north, the city and county of San Francisco in the center of our park, and San Mateo County in the south. The urban areas directly adjacent to our park are home to approximately 2.5 million people, and we have 17 million visitors each year. So we have the most visitors of any national park in the United States. So a really complicated landscape in which to be managing fire. So the first thing I want to talk about is that we focus on the wildland-urban interface. And just to define that term for anyone who's not familiar with it, really what that means is just a place where human development either directly abuts, is adjacent to, or intermixed with natural landscapes. And as I was saying, in many places, fire on the ecological side is beneficial, and where it has the biggest impacts is on human communities. So that's why we really want to focus our efforts on the wildland-urban interface, which means preparing communities for a wildfire. For most of our systems, it's not if a fire is going to happen, but really when a fire is going to happen, and that we need to be ready. All the science shows that the most effective thing we can be doing is defensible space around structures, homes, and buildings. And that really, it's a super simple concept. It just means making sure that we remove vegetation in the area immediately around a home. And so also along with that, evacuation routes, education, really making sure people know and are prepared. And one specific program we have around defensible space in the wildland-urban interface here at Golden Gate is a boundary vegetation management program. We have 40 miles of wildland-urban interface on our boundary, which is much more than we have the capacity to manage the vegetation along. And so we've developed this boundary vegetation management program where park neighbors can apply to the park to remove fuels on park lands to cut back vegetation to create defensible space adjacent to their homes where it's on park lands. And so this image just shows a snippet of our boundary. The boundary line is in yellow. The lands north of the yellow line are our park. And so what's happened here is these neighbors have pulled together and applied for a permit to create this defensible space zone on park lands. Park ecologists vet the work to make sure that it's ecologically appropriate, and our fire managers make sure it's doing good in terms of reducing fire risk. But it's a great way that we can really increase our capacity. The neighbors are doing this work at their own expense, and they're able to feel that they're protecting their homes. Another really key piece when thinking about fire, because it operates at such a large scale, a fire doesn't stop at jurisdictional boundaries. So similarly, our management can't stop at jurisdictional boundaries. In Marin County, in the northern portion of our park, a really exciting new effort is underway where a joint powers authority has been established through a ballot measure funded by a parcel tax that the voters, elected to tax themselves to create this JPA, the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. And what this allows us to do is to coordinate between, local municipal fire departments, cities, park agencies, and all work together and look at this problem at scale and implement solutions that really make sense, fuel reductions along the most vulnerable communities, even when that crosses between parklands and, municipal lands, and really making sure our communities are prepared. Similarly, more on the ecological side, we have a collaborative of parks agencies and our nonprofit partner, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, called OneTAM, that works on a variety of ecological issues at scale in Marin County. And one piece of what we're working on is a forest resilience plan. And so what that plan is doing is identifying strategies that we can do across all of Marin County that really make the most sense, both to reduce fire risk and to increase the ecological health and resilience of our forests. And so then I get the last piece that I'm going to talk about in terms of strategies for wildfire is reducing fuels. As I said, in the Bay Area, we're really in a system where the extreme fire behavior when we have it is caused by weather events. So when we do fuel reduction work, we really do it in strategic locations where it's right adjacent to communities, and where we also are increasing ecological resilience and benefits to our natural systems. So one of the tools we use is thinning and vegetation removal. This image is of an understory thinning project in a eucalyptus forest. Eucalyptus is a non-native invasive species in the Bay Area. And so by thinning the forest, we get fire benefits where we have, decreased ladder fuels and less of a chance for the fire to jump from the forest floor into the canopy where it has, the potential to spread faster and do much more harm. And at the same time, we're opening up the forest floor, native species are able to establish, and we're increasing our biodiversity. We also use prescribed fire as a tool. And again, we do it really where we're gaining the most ecological benefit. And so this is a grassland burn in Marin County, and we're also reducing a non-native species, French broom, which has invaded this grassland. So we're kind of getting a win-win with this fire. We're reducing fuels and increasing the resilience of the grassland. Here's another example of some experimental burns we did in San Mateo County, where we were actually using fire to improve habitat for an endangered butterfly species. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to say is the sort of flip side to ecological benefit and improving resilience is minimizing harm. In these fire adapted systems, oftentimes the most harm from a wildfire actually comes from putting the fire out. So this is an image of an air tanker dropping fire retardant. If that fire retardant lands on a sensitive a sensitive riparian area, it's going to cause a lot of damage. And similarly, bulldozers are a commonly used tool for putting out wildfires, and we don't want to bulldoze sensitive habitat. And so it's really critical to work with fire management agencies in advance and do pre-planning to, make sure the folks who will be putting out the fire know where the sensitive resources are and the most critical places to avoid in the case of a wildfire. Because again, it's not a matter of if, but it's really when for many of our Western ecosystems. So I'm going to stop there and pass the baton back to Michael. I'm happy to answer questions if we have time.
Thanks, Alison. I think we'll hold till the end for questions.
Okay.
And I just want to remind everybody, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to pose to our three panelists, please use the Q&A function, and I will curate those at the end of our presentation. So thanks again, Alison. Our second speaker this morning is Kevin Conger. Kevin is the president of CMG Landscape Architecture in San Francisco. Kevin is a founding partner of CMG, an organization that promotes democratic public space and urban ecology as the cornerstone of resilience in projects. Their project credits include the San Francisco Waterfront Resilience Program, which is adapting 7.5 miles of urban waterfront for sea level rise in 2100. Their firm is working on the regeneration of the defunct military base at Treasure Island and Hunters Point, and also working on the community-based Yerba Buena Street Life Plan. Kevin's presentation this morning will focus on his firm's work to adapt Crissy Field, a park that Kevin and I collaborated on 20 plus years ago. Can't believe how long ago that was, Kevin, for the changing impacts of climate change. All right, Kevin, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Let's see if I can get myself going here. Sorry about that. I've somehow. Okay, let me try that again. Share screen. And are you seeing my screen, Michael? I think you probably are. All right. Good morning. I'm going to talk about sea level rise adaptation through the Crissy Field project, and it's really in a context, broader context of Crissy Field as a very interesting site, a very interesting urban park that has been in a constant state of change for the last 150 years or so. The indigenous people in this part of California were the Ohlone tribes that have been here for a long, long time, and we acknowledge their presence and continued presence as an ongoing part of the stewardship of Crissy Fields. But they were settled in this area because of the rich resources along the San Francisco Bay as a food source and also material resources. The military, the U.S. military set up a presence here in the mid-1800s along this part of the San Francisco shoreline and began to fill this area of Crissy Field. You can see here in the red oval there, there's a blue area, which was, this area was largely tidal marshes, and the military began to fill that so that it would be more suitable for the operations. That military use continued until the mid-1990s. In 1915, the Pan-Pacific International Exposition was to take place on this site, and there was a number of improvements for the expo, including the building of what would become an airfield and many other facilities for that World Expo. The airfield housed a large racetrack, wooden racetrack, that they raced cars around as just one of the events in the 1915 Pan Expo. After the expo, the base became an airfield in the 1920s for the famed biplane fighter planes that would roll out of the adjacent hangars and take off on the grass airfield. That's where Crissy Field got its name from this period. And indeed, this period from the 1919 to 1925 is the period of significance for the most historical assets at Crissy Field, many of which still exist today. But the base continued on as that function afterwards and served in later wars as a site for deployment and military activity, including upgrading the airfield to a more modern paved airfield uses, which you see in this image here. But the base closed in 1994, and before that, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy was formed and announced plans to do a Crissy Field restoration in anticipation that that would become national parkland, which it did. That part of the Presidio was transferred to the National Park Service in the mid-1990s. In 1998, the Conservancy completed the master plan and did significant fundraising to build Crissy Field, which opened up in 2001, 100 acres at a cost of $34 million and an annual operating cost of $700,000. And these images show you on the top some of the before images from the mid-90s. It was largely a kind of dilapidated paved parking lot areas. The military hadn't really been using it for quite a while in the 80s and 90s. The shoreline was rubble strewn from the landfill and dumping that occurred there. And then after the transformation down below is a picture looking over the marsh. The design of Crissy Field was led by the Parks Conservancy. Hargraves Associates were the landscape architects. And it was interesting in that they overlaid these two layers of history, the tidal marsh layer, which is illustrated here in blue, and the cultural history layer of the airfield, which is overlaid here in red, to create this early concept plan that showed those two components, the overlay of the cultural history and the natural history. And then this is a later plan that shows the four main areas of Crissy Field: the East Beach, the tidal marsh in the middle, which is a constructed tidal marsh, the airfield, and the West Bluff. And a couple images of what that looks like as a built construction for some of you guys who maybe haven't been there. There's a 20-acre tidal marsh in the middle. Beautiful views of the Golden Gate Bridge overlooking the airfields. It's just amazing to be on the waterfront in this part of San Francisco in nature. And it's really popular with active recreation for windsurfers and sailors and beachgoers down at the East Beach and picnickers down on the west end at the West Bluff, with a very simple promenade that connects the entire waterfront along the 1 mile length, which is really, really popular with runners, bikers, and all kinds of people going out there to recreate. And of course, although the site is amazing and the ecological and natural assets are important, the people are the most important asset of all. And it's very popular with the community members of all walks of life in San Francisco. So although Crissy Field is wonderful, it's not entirely perfect. And in 2014, we began another collaboration with the Conservancy to look at ways to improve it, and that was called Crissy Refresh. It was thought of as a master plan for the next 20 years of Crissy Field, focused on really just, I would call it minor tweaks to make it better for more people, enhance the quality of the user experience, maintain the integrity of the original design of Crissy Field, further celebrate the historic character and the natural resources. We did a lot of user surveys of people that had been going to Crissy Field, and it was interesting. A lot of people didn't know it was a national park. They didn't know it was a historic airfield. So we wanted to kind of enhance those things, attract underserved communities. It's a long way for people from the southern part of the city to get to Crissy Field, and they were not coming as much as we would hope that they would. We wanted to balance the maintenance investments with returns. Some of the areas are quite expensive and require a lot of labor to maintain. Integrate with the surrounding resources. A lot has changed in the Presidio since the building of Crissy Field, and so its context is different, and to improve circulation and access for all modes. So a lot of user interface and outreach to find out what people liked and didn't like about Crissy Field. This is the roving ranger. A lot of community workshops with people that love Crissy Fields. And it led to a couple of big framework ideas to enhance nature, to increase the interpretation both of the natural areas, the constructed tidal marsh, and the historic areas through improved natural interpretation areas, bird blinds, things like that. Also the historic pieces by doing more on the airfield so people would be able to understand it as an airfield. Increase programming overall and add more comforts for people. So showing some ways of adding some new programs out onto the airfield, improving the circulation on the promenade. Importantly, improving circulation on the Mason Street side, which is where the most change has happened in the Presidio, particularly with the new Tunnel Tops Park that's being built. So the proposal is to build a new bike promenade along that to better protect pedestrians and cyclists from running into one another. And the question is, what about sea level rise? We began to think about that before we were going to do any of these major investments into the park for the next 20 years. We wanted to make sure that those investments were going to be protected through their life cycle cost, certainly, and that we weren't going to be investing money for things that might be threatened or vulnerable. Crissy Field already gets close to some flooding. These are some images of king tides that are happening in blue sky king tide days. So there's not things that are vulnerable right now, but it's getting close enough that we thought that we should do a sea level rise analysis. So we partnered with the Parks Conservancy and the California Coastal Conservancy, which gave the Parks Conservancy a grant to do a sea level rise analysis, which we called Rise Up. And its goals were to summarize the science on sea level rise and then compile data of the vulnerability of Crissy Field at various sea level rise scenarios, 1, 2, 3, and 6 feet, and assess the vulnerability of the existing conditions. Importantly, to share this data back out with the community and raise awareness overall of the issues of climate change and sea level rise. And then lastly, to understand the adaptation strategies for Crissy Field as it relates to the Crissy Refresh project, which I just talked about. Sea level rise has been occurring for a long time. This image shows the Golden Gate here, where the Golden Gate Bridge is now. This is a map from showing what the sea level was like 20,000 years ago, where the sea level was 400 feet lower than it is now, and the Sacramento River ran all the way out through the gate and out past the Farallon Islands. And looking to the future with 6 feet of sea level rise, we may in fact see that it's a much, much different coastline with a lot of low-lying areas in the Bay Area flooded and a lot of vulnerability to communities all throughout the Bay Area. This chart shows the correlation between sea level at the top. This spike right here is the last 20,000 years, when after the last glacial melt. This middle one shows global temperatures that have been measured. So you can see the correlation between the global temperatures and the sea level. And the lower one shows CO2 concentrations, and you see the correlation in those spikes between global temperature and sea level rise with CO2 concentration. And what's particularly alarming here is you see this vertical spike in the last 1,000 years or so, which is somewhat concerning, obviously, for the correlation to sea level rise. Now, sea level rise, if we zoom in the timeline a little bit, this is going back 20,000 years. It shows that 400-foot elevation in sea level rise, but this flat area up here at the top is the last 8,000 years or so, and human settlement largely has occurred. Civilization has expanded just in this last couple of thousand years where there has not been much sea level rise, and because of that, we've all moved into these coastline areas because that's where there's a lot of resources and food and other things, and so we've settled into this very vulnerable geography at a point when sea level rise has been flat. And during that period, we have radically expanded the world population, which has had an effect on the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And in fact, those CO2 concentrations, as we all know, are continuing to rise. And so that is an area for concern. Now, how that relates to sea level rise is what we are thinking about in this study. And we have good data on sea level rise because right in this little pier right here is in fact the oldest continually operating sea level rise monitoring station in the United States and the second oldest in the world. It's been in operation continuously for over 150 years. It's on this pier right here, just inside the Golden Gate Bridge. And so the data collected from that, which is shown here, shows about 8 inches of sea level rise in the last 100 years. So we know that it's occurring at this location, and we have good data on that. But what we don't know is where it's going to go from here. And now that 8 inches is shown here in this left end of this chart. And what's unknown is how is it going to continue to accelerate, and how much higher is it going to go as we go out into the future, 2100 and beyond. This shows a range of scenarios, and there's many ranges that are now estimated to be even much higher than 6 feet by 2100 and even up to 10, 12 feet. So tides, of course, are one of the big factors in the vulnerability due to sea level rise. Just a quick refresh for you guys. Tides are created by the gravitational forces of the moon and the sun. When the moon and the sun combine, we have stronger tidal swings than during the neap tide period, where they are in opposition to one another. The tides go up and down twice a day, so there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a 24-hour period generally, and that varies across all of the months. This is just an example of 1 month, depending on where the moon and the sun are, and also their proximity to Earth and our proximity to the sun. If you take all of those tides for a given month, this is 1 month, January to February, at the Golden Gate, you begin to see those swings all together. The middle of that is called mean sea level. Mean high water is the average of the high tides. Mean higher high water is the average of the highest tides. This is one of the sea level rise levels that we're most concerned about, because the frequency is high enough that it can be more than just an inconvenience, but can start to do damage. King tides are the highest of those high tides. They happen around 6 to 10 times in a given year, and they are of concern for assets that could be damaged if they flood only once or just once or twice. Buildings and so forth are of those concerns. And in addition to this, there are storm surges, which are caused by low atmospheric pressure when storms come over. And so when these storms are in the area on top of the king tide, we can see these increased tide surges that can be a foot or even a foot and a half above the predicted tide. So those are of concern. And then lastly, in addition to that, there's wave run up, which can then push the tide up a little higher. We don't have at the Crissy Field site a lot of wave energy. There is a little bit, but it is somewhat of a concern, because as the waves push the tide, it can run up further. We see this a bit down at Crissy Field. This is down at 4 Point, where the waves do begin to run up and this hardened edge along the seawall. But most of Crissy Field, since its restoration, we removed all of that rubble when the park was built, and most of it is now sand beaches, which are more vulnerable to the wave run-up, because as the sea level rise and wave run-up occurs, the sand beach begins to retreat to maintain its natural angle of repose. And so those sand beaches can be vulnerable. And in some instances at Crissy Field, where we have hardened assets like these seawalls along the sand beach, again, as the wave run-up and sea level rise occurs, those can become vulnerable and become undermined. So those are somewhat of concern. So what the process was to look at all the existing conditions, all of the areas out at Crissy Field that are of value and might in fact be vulnerable. We mapped all of those in different categories: historic, archaeological, and cultural resources. There are a lot of historic assets out at Crissy Field. All of these red buildings are historic and important. Natural resources such as the dunes, the tidal marsh, dunes in this area, there's a dune swale over here, were all mapped. The public access and recreational assets such as the promenade, the airfields, the pier, all the places that the public enjoys to go. And then there are some infrastructure and utility assets out there, mostly related to stormwater outfalls that are capturing water off of the large watershed of the Presidio and bringing it either filtered through the tidal marsh or Quartermaster's Reach or outfalled onto the beach itself. And we then mapped those against different sea level rise scenarios, current tide. I'm going to make these maps larger in a second so you can read them, but just to give you the context, mean high water, king tide, and the 100-year tide, which is the flood that has a 1% chance of happening in any 1 year. And again, we did that against the 1 foot of sea level rise, 2, 3, and 6, and began to look at what became vulnerable. So this is Crissy Field currently in mean high water. With current king tide, you can see that there's really no issues. With the current 100-year tide, there's really no issues. There's some encroachment onto the beaches, but those are resilient to where they can withstand that. If we add 1 foot of sea level rise, there's not a lot of issue. At the king tide, there's really not a lot of issue. When we get 1 foot of sea level rise and the 100-year tide, we do begin to get some inland flooding. It's mostly water that's backing up through the storm system and coming up in some of these areas around some of the buildings. But when we start to add 2 feet and we start to get up to the 100-year, it does start to become a problem, where we're starting to get some of that backing up water moving into the buildings and some of these historic assets. You see that the promenade is becoming flooded down here at one end. 3 feet, though, does start to get to be a problem when we get out into this king tide in 100-year tide scenarios. Now, that was pretty good news for us when we were thinking about the refresh, because I think it's realistic that we're not going to see 3 feet of sea level rise for probably at least 50 years, if not longer. So that means that the types of investments that we would make now into improvements at Crissy Field probably would be in good shape for their life cycle. So that was relatively good news. However, when you do start to look out longer term, 6 feet of sea level rise, even at mean high water, you see a lot, Crissy Field is going to be a much different place. When you add a king tide to that and a 100-year tide, there's very few areas that are actually going to be dry. So the future of Crissy Field long term is certainly going to be very different than it is now. So we took all this information and we organized what we call a Rise Up community workshop, where we shared it out with community members and stakeholders to share with them what we had learned. We organized an interactive exercise for them and gave them an adaptation toolkit, which included things like retreat, protection through soft measures such as beach nourishment or creating dunes, some engineered solutions like seawalls, levees, ripraps, some natural solutions such as wetlands and reefs, adaptable floodable buildings, some infrastructure solutions, even pump stations. And we organized all these around these game boards, where we gave them these game pieces and sea level rise scenarios. This map is for the 6 foot sea level rise scenario. We also did working groups that worked on the 3-foot sea level rise scenarios. And we asked them to work collaboratively with one another and come up with a plan for what they thought was most important and what they would like to, what they thought would be a possibility to do to save, retreat, whatever. And then we asked them to report out. And we then took their maps that they generated and started to summarize them. Here's just a couple of examples. This group decided to retreat and give up the historic buildings that were across the street to retreat from the airfield and expand that into a wetland and to pretty much make most of the park natural, and even in the 3-foot sea level rise. This group decided to retreat from the beach, convert some of these buildings to wetlands and maintain some of the public access through new walkways. This group, for the 6 feet of sea level rise, decided to elevate Mason Street as a levee and protect all the historic buildings that are behind Mason Street, and then essentially retreat from all of the Crissy field, but maintain a walkway, boardwalk through the park. So we then kind of lumped together some of these stakeholder ideas that had similarities into diagrams that showed areas of retreat in blue, areas of protect in the beige color, and the primary public access ideas. And we created more illustrated maps that kind of summarize that with all of their ideas. So this group, for example, decided to expand the marsh over here and to increase the tidal prism of the marsh and remove the non-historic commissary building while doing beach nourishment and other things out on the side. This group was a little bit more aggressive and wanted to expand the marsh even further and remove parts of the East Beach, but to raise the Mason Street and protect all the historic buildings. This group was even more radical and wanted to retreat even further, removing all of the airfield in the 6-foot scenario, maintaining just a boardwalk through there and some dunes if they could be feasible outbound of that, but to elevate Mason Street and protect the historic assets. And then this group basically said, what's the point? We should invest in other places and retreat and make this more natural. So they removed all the historic assets, expanded the marsh largely, and tried to build up a sand-based dune system to protect this side of the marsh in a full retreat scenario. And so what we're doing now is environmental review on the Crissy Refresh project with all of this sea level rise input from the community in mind, and trying to anticipate next steps for moving forward with the next phase of Crissy Field. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you, Kevin. I'm always chagrined when I listen to you speak and I learn things about my own park. I had no idea about the tidal monitoring station, actually, so very cool. All right, our third and final speaker is Lucinda Sanders, CEO and partner at Boland in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Cindy is responsible for continually shaping Boland as a leader in design excellence and sustainability amongst the complex challenges of the profession. She's led the design of many of Boland's signature projects, including the Comcast Center Plaza and Central Delaware Riverfront Master Plan in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, GAP headquarters in San Francisco, California, and Fountain Square in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her current projects include an urban design plan for 30th Street Station in Philadelphia and large-scale urban developments in China. Cindy will speak with us today about her firm's effort to create a park that embraces the increasingly intense flooding of the Ohio River at the Ohio River Greenway. Cindy, good morning.
All right, thank you, Michael. Great to be here. So I would like to talk to you today about an ambitious park initiative spearheaded by the River Heritage Conservancy and its executive director, Scott Martin, whom you heard first up today. I will talk about that project, but it's really important. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about water. I will talk a bit about the significance of the site, and then I'll share with you our ideas for program and the adaptation of that program to the flood scenario. So we usually think about water at the coasts, but rarely do we think about it in the middle of the country, and we rarely think about it in the context of climate change. We might talk about species migration in the middle of the country, but one of the things that became pretty clear last year is that the soil saturation related to climate change was having a very significant impact on flooding. So this is our site on the Ohio River. And this is a projection of about 50 years. So they are predicting a 5 to 15% change in stream flow along the majority of the Ohio River over the next 5 to 8 decades. One of the things that's kind of intriguing is you're seeing even greater saturation upland and inland from that water. And that, again, probably has more to do with the soil saturation related to climate change. So there is very little doubt in our minds when we came upon this site that the Ohio River contributes to something we early on called the raw awe of the site, because the site already, even without these effects of climate change, experiences dramatic flooding, upwards 30 to 60 feet on an annual basis. So most of this flooding, this is looking at a 10-year time frame. Most of this flooding is happening on this very repetitive pattern and on an annual basis. And when we overlay all of those years onto the duration of January to December, we see that the bulk of that flooding occurs in February to May, but not exclusively. You can see some years that popped up in September, for instance. So in fact, the site itself sees an average of about 10 days a year in a flooded condition. So why, one of the interesting things when we came to this project is, why was this site here in the first place? Because it's not terribly obvious. It was not terribly obvious to us in the beginning. So geomorphologically, the site is very significant. It happens to contain one of the largest exposed Devonian era fossil beds. And this zone today is now called the Falls of the Ohio State Park, and it attracts many, many visitors to this location. So the falls have a storied history. I don't expect you to read any of this, but it's a long history. It's an important history. People have been attracted to this location on the Ohio River for thousands of years. A couple of key elements that occurred in this history is that the bison would cross the Ohio River in lower water in the summertime. And in fact, something called the buffalo trace is a pretty well-known phenomenon. Hunters and travelers would follow the buffalo. So that was very significant. Early Native Americans settled here. The little town of Clarksville up above is something that is a town that they tried to establish, but you will see that the water wanted to have its way. So a couple of important figures here is George Rogers Clark, an American patriot military officer. on the northwestern frontier during the American Revolution. And so this site is also kind of a gateway to the Northwest Territory, and his probably more famous brother, William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, purportedly began his expeditions from this location. But like humans are wont to do, kind of controlling nature and opening up the river for navigation, because those fossil beds were not navigable in low tide. There were many engineering interventions that occurred, along with other infrastructure that was built for the generation of electricity. And so our site is this dark spot. And again, you know, why was this place here? Well, we can go back to the 1937 flood. And we're looking over Louisville to the park site. And one of the things that was done in response to this flood is a levee was built to protect the adjacent neighborhoods. And I always found it interesting that they decided to trace the neighborhoods instead of building the levee at the water's edge. But that fortuitous decision actually has allowed this project to even be a possibility. So the Ohio, as I've said, floods, but it's not the only contributing element to the water on this site. There are many watersheds, so these off-site contributing elements are very significant. Silver Creek to the north, which looks like this, and I actually had the opportunity to see the stream flow uphill during one of these flood events. If you haven't seen it before in a flood, it's quite amazing. There are all these sort of manufactured and engineered components to the town of Clarksville and Jeffersonville to the east that is primarily flowing into the site through pipes. And leaving bodies of water that look like this in both a flooded and unflooded state. There are standing bodies of water that are pretty much throughout the year in varying depths. So those look like this, which is my backdrop today, Buttonbush Woods. When it floods in the wintertime, it is one of these surreal places, and the ecology is pretty amazing. And so when we step back and kind of put all these layers of action stage flooding, minor flooding, moderate flooding, major flooding on top of each other, this is the diagram that we get. And the question then is, whoa, well, where's the park? And how are we going to do a park here? And that was, I think, one of the most fun parts of making this master plan, is integrating the plan with the water. And Michael Gage, who was an early consultant on the project, I said it very succinctly, everything here comes back to water. So before I go to the plan itself, one of the other things that you should know is, because this land was outside the levee, it's not in the towns, which is inside the levee, we were outside the levee, it has suffered tremendous disrespect over the years. So while it had an agrarian history at one point, it's quickly transformed into a very abused kind of landscape of dumping. And this is still ongoing at this moment, but it's one of the things that, of course, will stop. So we have a highly polluted landscape. I should also say they excavated this at one point to build the levee. So it's been excavated and it's been filled. And one could say there's nothing natural about this site, but one of the things that is remarkable is nature doesn't wait for a landscape architect. Nature is not waiting for somebody to come in with the design hand. Nature has already come in and inhabited this landscape. So what are we trying to do here? Louisville has a terrific park system. Olmsted had a very big hand in the parks. There's this more ambitious Louisville Loop, and then there are these river parks that have started to be built in Louisville. And bridge connections have been made, and we see where the red dot is kind of a missing link, that we can create these 3 nested layers of loops connecting one side of the river to the other, and that this park will play a phenomenally important role in that. Likewise, this park, we're looking toward Louisville in the upper right-hand screen over the park. And you can see the falls, and you can see the channelization of the river and the dams that control the water level, but they don't prevent flooding. I mean, this is kind of the thing that you'll see in a moment, but making these connections to the community, to the communities that are inside the levee is an important piece of this project. So we pretty early on realized that we needed to understand how much of this site is low, how much is it in the middle range, and how much of it is already high. Because don't imagine doing a lot of earthwork here, but rather living with the systems that are operating today. You can see that nearly 50% of the site is low. That's a big chunk. It also happens to be the 50% of the site that, if you will, nature has kind of come in and reclaimed. And so we had this approach. We said, leave the restoration, leave the revegetation piece alone. Anything that has already established itself, leave it alone. Honor topography, build around water, and then let's figure where our paths and our programs are. We also have a very ambitious programmatic idea and experiential engagement with this landscape. It's a landscape of views and skies. It's one of adventure already. We're looking to enhance that. It's one of established nature and wildlife as well. It is incredibly dramatic in many different ways, in the low water, the high water, the stillness, the possibility of introducing motion. And then we think that there's a very big opportunity here for building over time this understanding and curation of stewardship and engagement with the community. So starting out possibly through spectating different events, through participating in those, you know, if you spectate, then maybe you'll participate. Maybe you'll develop into a leader and teach and foster this stewardship for the future. So we took these ideas, we took these topographic ideas and the vegetation and started to lay out program around the site. I just want to go through, if this video will, yeah, so this is the water. This is how the water comes in. You can see in the beginning, it doesn't have much effect on the site because it's coming up the banks of the Ohio, but very quickly, the site does this most winters, not the full entirety this way, but as it comes back down, right about here, the site is flooding to that point. So it's pretty dramatic, and it said everything, it gave us the clue what we needed to be doing with our topography and our program. now I just need, now that I've made the video play, I just need to figure out how to advance this. So I'm just going to do a quick command here to see if there we go. And so if we break these levels down and we understand that at low water elevation, sure, most of the site is available. There's an opportunity in the lowest areas to do boardwalks that probably will not be accessible as the water floods. So it helped to inform us what kind of pathways, what kind of investment we might be making in some of these areas. So this is in the lowland and Buttonbush Woods. We imagine these very simple boardwalks and earthen paths threading through this already reestablished vegetation. We also imagine that the quarry that is on the site is something that can be repurposed and built into a sort of, if you will, level 2 kind of paddling experience, as well as a very rich ecosystem. And so as the water starts to rise and less of that site becomes available, we're thinking about these sort of mid-range, higher level areas like the industrial meadows that might have a significant path through there, but really it's about restoring ecology. We have imagined that the whole circulation system allows people to come into this park at some of the moderate flood elevation. So the park would still be open. Mind you, this is, I think it's about 50 feet above the gauge at this point, or 40 feet above the gauge, that has informed us where these circulation routes would occur. Very important bike loop, Greenway loop, which is part of this bigger loop network that we talked about. Vehicles can come into the park and experience the flood. Come back to this idea of the raw awe. It's fantastic. So rather than trying to hold the waters back, we're saying, come on in, we'll work with you. So many of the elements are in higher elevations, elements like the Clark cabin, elements like the base camp where we see visitors coming, picnic sheds, the offices, the rangers' offices, possibly tree houses, things where there is, I'm going to say, more major investment in infrastructure and utilities. Those are all in the higher elevations. And we have built this iconic element into the plan, something called the Infinity Loop, that allows people to circulate in about 6-mile loop through the park at some of the most extreme kinds of flooding throughout the season. And likewise, one of the signature spaces is the Buffalo Trace Lawn, which is an elevated, it's one of these elevated fill sections. It's like, okay, the fill is there, let's use it, let's cap it, let's build on top of it. So we're really trying to work with the systems of the park. Of course, at some point, a super major flood. So this is one of the openings through the levee. They would put a gate in at a super elevation flood and the park would be closed, although you could still be on top of the levee. This is the next highest route. So that would enable you to circle the park completely. So really the whole strategy has been to work with the river. It's such a spectacular and dramatic event. It's happening now. It's probably going to, more than anything, increase in frequency than in its actual height. But we think that this is going to be a very fun place, and it's very ambitious, but a lot of fun. And you know, now more than ever during the pandemic, we need places like this. It's proven to us that our landscapes are vital to our well-being, our emotional and intellectual well-being. So thank you very much. That's what we're up to.
Awesome, Cindy, thank you so much. I hope that you and Scott have printed up raw t-shirts and you're selling them as a fundraising strategy to build this incredible park. It's a really fantastic project. So I wonder if I could ask our panelists to reappear magically on screen. We have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. But first, I just wanted to reflect on a couple of themes. I mean, we've heard a number of really interesting themes today. Of course, we've heard about the importance of science, something we all know when thinking about adaptation planning in parks. We've also heard about the importance of partnerships. I think, Alison, you really highlighted that adaptation really requires new kinds of multi-jurisdictional efforts and multi-jurisdictional partnerships like ONE-TAM and the JPA you created to manage the 40 miles of boundary, which is a staggering amount of real estate that you have to tend to. We also heard a lot about the critical role of the public. And interestingly, I think when it comes to adaptation, we're not only thinking about the public as a source of ideas and inspiration, but actually a force for helping government agencies engage in adaptation work itself. And again, Alison, you painted a really interesting example of that, thinking about the boundary management work that you're doing in GGNRA. Lastly, Kevin, you talked about a number of things. You talked about some of the trade-offs, and I think it's really interesting that the public really rolled up their sleeves and focused on the trade-offs between natural and cultural resources when dealing with adaptation, but also thinking about time and some of the trade-offs between the kinds of activities that you'd undertake if you were adapting a park long-term versus the time horizon of park improvements and the kind of judgments that you ended up having to make with your client about the kinds of activities that actually made sense in the context of that. Obviously, parks and NGOs that support parks don't have endless supplies of money. And so thinking through those trade-offs in your project, I think is a really important lesson for all of us, that we can't solve the problem forever, but we can solve the problem within the likely time horizon of the kinds of park improvements we're making. And then lastly, Cindy, I think your project really represents one of the flip sides of thinking about adaptation, which is thinking about climate change and natural process and some of these impacts as a source of form, and really rethinking parks and in their 2.0 and 3.0 versions as embracing climate change and the impacts of climate change and as inspiration and sources of form. And I'm going to steal the raw. I tell you, you should patent it sooner, like you should have already, because we're all going to steal it now. Everyone on this panel is probably already printing their own t-shirts. So thank you all. Really, really a series of 3 wonderful presentations. I thought it would be good just to dig, you know, it's, we're all park managers, and we all have like to talk about the happy stories. So I want to talk a bit about some of the challenges, and even if you're all willing, talk a little bit about epic fails. Again, all of these projects have really depended on the public and on working with the public. And so I wonder if in these projects, if any of you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've encountered working with the public in this either adaptation planning work or in the implementation of your adaptation strategies in your parks. So anyone, any thoughts about that to share with our guests today?
I'll jump in. I don't mind talking about failures. I mean, the thing that's interesting at Crissy Field, it's just been a park that's been largely accessible to the public for the past 20 years. And before that, it was really known by very few people, although it has been accessible to the public for 20 years before that. But the thing about it is that people really love it. and they love it for different reasons. And those reasons are oftentimes in opposition to one another. And those people that love it for a specific thing, they don't want that thing to change, or they don't want to compromise that thing at all. The functionality of that, or the accessibility of that activity, whatever it is. And that can really be a sticking point when talking about making changes for improvements that may be intended to invite more people, to be more inclusive, even because those improvements might mean some sort of compromise to that one user group. And that can oftentimes be a sticking point when talking about adapting or transforming one of these beloved parks. Now, what's interesting, when you take out of the conversation the notion that you're going to make a trade-off that might compromise this group to give greater access to another group, and you take that out and you say, look, it's about a climate change related issue like sea level rise, then a lot of times those defensive postures go away, because especially through the Rise Up exercise, where you're really asking them to grapple with it and make a recommendation themselves, that they're much more open to actually contemplating change when they see that it's inevitable. And in fact, around sea level rise and other climate change issues, it is inevitable. There is no stay the same scenario. That's actually not an option at all. Things are going to change, and the question is, how are we going to change them?
Alison, Cindy, any thoughts about the sort of challenges of working with the public around climate change?
Sure. I will chime in. Our public work has not yet been as extensive. It's on its way. And I would say that maybe one is on this. Kevin, you're in San Francisco. I think you have a large following of climate change believers. And I would say that that's not universal across the country. So I think that's something to be cognizant of. Not everybody's on this boat right now, still. I would say the other thing, and this is more about stakeholders, because we have had extensive stakeholder engagement, and that is the Army Corps of Engineers. And they, their primary objective is navigation. Yet this this chunk of the Ohio is actually the only national wildlife conservation area of 1,400 acres. And it's the Army Corps has sort of jurisdiction over it, and it's a little bit unclear when we talk to them what they're doing on that front of being a steward of this conservation idea. So there are also major erosion activities, I didn't even talk about that are coming from the dam. One of the dams points right to our site. So from a stakeholder perspective, I think there are very serious challenges on our park, and we take this one so seriously that Olin Labs has devoted and set up a project around it to try to kind of tackle this issue.
Thanks.
And Michael, I would just jump in to say that, specifically to wildfire, I've seen public perceptions change so dramatically in the Bay Area. The work that we did prior to 2016 was often pretty controversial and met with a lot of public pushback at various projects at various sites. And, in 2016, there were very big fires in the North Bay. And then we had, 3 really years in Northern California of bad fire seasons, one after another. And it's completely changed the public perception, and the support for doing the kind of adaptation work that we're doing has just dramatically increased. And our neighbors are now asking us to be doing more instead of doing less, which has just been interesting to see it really turn on a dime when it impacts people directly.
Yeah, well, as a Bay Area resident, I can tell you the last few years have been really unbelievable. The impact palpable for everyone living in the Bay Area. So it's really incredible. You know, Alison, you're tangentially bringing up one of the next questions I wanted to ask everybody, which really has to do with, you know, we tend to think of these adaptation strategies as often aligning well with our ecological restoration or natural process restoration strategies. But I'm wondering if in your work, you've actually encountered situations where you've had to make trade-offs between those things, either because you don't have enough room to implement the kind of strategy that you would like to, or because, Cindy, as you pointed out, you might have stakeholders or agencies that have different mandates or missions that are actually requiring you to implement a strategy that actually is at odds with those restoration goals. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak to that.
Sure, I'll jump in here. I would say that invasive species management is a big one. As you can imagine, in such a disturbed landscape, and one that floods, there's a lot of seed bank that comes in that is largely invasive. And so we have had to pick and choose very carefully where that management will occur. It's not going to happen everywhere. And so there is this idea that some of the more visible areas, but then as I'm learning more and more about this, that really altering that seed bank and kind of giving natives a bigger toehold it's not an overnight fix, right? It's a long-term strategy and one that we probably will never ever fully get on top of.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. Yep. Kevin or Alison?
Yeah, I'll piggyback a little on that. And this is really to Cindy's point about what I feel is an enlightened community in the Bay Area. And it's around ecological restoration in the Bay. And for those others that might be listening that are not aware, with the San Francisco Bay Area counties, the 9 counties around the Bay passed Measure AA now, was it a year, basically a year and a half ago now, which is a wetland restoration measure around the Bay Area to restore and create new wetlands around the Bay. And that is really indicative of a enlightened point of view and an understanding and a value of the natural systems in the Bay and their importance. Most of the natural wetlands in the Bay Area have been lost over the last 150 years because they're low-lying and they're easy to fill to make other things happen, like what has happened at Crissy Field. And now the idea that they'll be further threatened, the few remnant wetlands around the Bay Area are going to be further threatened by sea level rise, has really, I think, brought to the forefront in people's minds the necessity to construct and restore new wetlands so that we maintain some ecological well-being. So I just think that's a remarkable thing in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's a really good model for the rest of the world.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think where this tension plays out in the fire world is that difference between the impact of fire to human communities versus natural communities. In the North Bay, this really happened after the fires in wine country, where folks who had homes adjacent to parks suddenly really didn't want that park in their backyard. You know, it was such a trauma for so many people lost their homes, and, you know, really educating people that defensible space is the most important thing. And, you know, there are many other values to having a park near your home. And that there is a risk of fire that comes along with that. And so that's been a tension that we've been working with, where, you know, those two things are just not always perfectly aligned.
Yeah, I remember once, Alison, we tried controlled burning in the Presidio about half a mile from Leader Pelosi's house. And that was a really exciting day. So, yeah. Some of those wildland strategies don't really work very well in an urban context. So I think the work that you do is just unbelievable, really unbelievable. So, you know, before we wind up, I just want to ask one last question. I think each of you really, you know, one of the things that you spoke to in various ways is this tension between the need to invest in adaptation strategies and the fact that parks in America are just woefully underfunded generally. And so the result is you're having to make trade-offs between investing in adaptation and investing in, the ongoing, creating facilities for the public or the ongoing operations of parks. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you work with your clients or with your partners to think through that. I mean, how do you make these choices about where you invest your resources?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and it's probably the biggest challenge at Crissy Field is it's really large and it's underfunded in terms of the maintenance budgets, and it's managed by the National Park Service, which is subject to the fluctuations of the federal government and its priorities, which have lately not been in parks. And I think we're constantly talking about the urgency and the value of the public space. I think it's heightened right now in these days because of COVID and the shelter in place, and people certainly appreciate the ability to get out and go into parks, but also because of the racial and social injustices that we've been suffering for forever, but they've really come to the forefront right now. And I think there's also an increasing awareness of the value of public space, democratic public space, spatial justice, as a place that people come together with one another, people that may not look like each other or be like each other, but they can share space and share experiences together, and through that develop empathy and compassion and be more of a united community. And I think now is the time for us to really push hard on this and make people really articulate the value of public space and parks in the well-being of people's lives.
I feel like our strategy at Golden Gate National Recreation Area has been to really focus on where we can get the win-wins. If you have to rebuild a facility, rebuild it with climate change in mind, rebuild it knowing that it's going to flood more, that the ocean or the bay is going to have, higher high tides, so that when we are investing, we're investing, smart. And I just keep trying to remind myself and our team that, as we've said a few times in this discussion, the San Francisco Bay Area public is a very sympathetic public on the topic of climate change. And we really need to be leading the way and showing other parks in other parts of the country how this can be done. So, we have a responsibility, I think, in that way beyond our boundaries to just really push this issue.
Yeah, all right.
I think that the flooding has made it pretty obvious. It was, of course, we had many ideas early on about creating islands and doing all these incredible interventions. And the reality kind of came home. Like, why are you taking a pretty good emergent woodland and changing it, right? So that was, I just feel that we all were in alignment on that. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean that the dollars conversations were easy, because they're, everybody's budgets are limited, and the capacity for funding, for grants, for raising dollars it's got a finite time frame or finite amount to it. And so those, Scott and I had a lot of long conversations about that, what to prioritize. And again, I think that once we decided to work with the flood, that was kind of a home run. Like, just go with what's there and let it happen, and take your dollars and put them in really the circulation networks that will remain for the most part out of flood conditions, and some of the structures that need to be above the flood conditions. So that was a pretty clear strategy.
Awesome.
And I'll add one thing as a client, Michael, is stories. Ultimately, we carry people's stories. We tell people's stories. The landscapes are stories. Once we embrace change as part of that story, and even if it's a dynamic one we don't control, I think it adds something to the visitor's experience, and it adds something to the authenticity of our work.
Yeah. Good stories and great swag. And so I'm looking forward to my t-shirt, Scott. Hey, listen, we have just 2 minutes left. I wondered if any of our panelists had one last thought they'd like to share with your audience before we close.
I love Scott's wrap up. Landscapes change, and they're going to change into the future, and we just need to accept that and try and be stewards.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, and I would also add just that we can't do this work without working on racial justice and equity. And, you know, that wasn't really the focus of today's panel, but just reminding us all that these two things are inextricably linked, and we can't make progress on one without the other. And so it's just so important. It's in the focus at this moment, and to carry that in our work as we go forward.
You're here. I mean, recent history has just underscored everything that has been said. And, you know, I think coming into climate change with an attitude of not resisting, but accepting and embracing is something that we can do with nature and with people. So.
All right, thank you. I want to give you a virtual round of applause from everyone that's participated in our panel today. A big thank you to Cindy, Alison, and Kevin. And thank you to all of you for both your work in making sure that the world is full of beautiful and accessible and equitably distributed parks, and for being part of our conversation today. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.